Welcome back to the Let's Be Friends podcast. With us today is Father Peter Heers. He's back to do a part 2 talking about baptism. And we're going to be talking about economia in this conversation and really diving into what that means and what the church fathers teach about that, what the saints say. And we're going to be discussing his book that on the reception of the heterodox into the Orthodox Church, the patristic consensus and criteria. I'm sure you guys already know him from Orthodox Ethos, his social media, his YouTube channel. He's also the founder of Uncut Mountain Press, which is a fantastic library of books that you can get on the internet. And that is where this book comes from. But Father Peter, thank you for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
I'm hopeful that we can assist our brothers and sisters on the path of salvation.
Absolutely. So what is economia and when is it appropriate to use that?
Well, let's start with the very term itself in Greek, which is ekos and nomos. So it's basically loosely translated the management of the household or the organization management, carrying out of the management of the household of faith, obviously in this context. So it's also first and foremost a Christological question. In other words, we talk about the economy of salvation. So it's the working out or the work of salvation that the Lord did. It's not referring to the three persons of the Trinity eternally, but it's referring to the incarnation of the Logos and everything that he did for us and for our salvation. So it's from that all the way to the second coming. This is the economy of salvation, how Christ has determined and with his great wisdom planned the salvation of the world, and obviously through in his body, the church. So it pertains more generally to the working out of salvation. It pertains more specifically to the management of the household of the church, which means the bishops and the priests, how they carry out. And so you have the what is also important to understand in terms of understanding economia is you have the akrivia or the exactitude of the teaching of the gospel. If you want to be saved, believe and be baptized. This is the gospel truth. The canons are generally restating and applying the gospel truth, obviously throughout church history and the ecumenical councils. But then you also have economia, which is a temporary departure. You can think of it as like a detour. So you're on the main road of salvation, and all of a sudden there's, for some reason, practical circumstance in history where you can't continue on that road, and there's an exception, there's exceptional circumstances, wars or whatever it might be, and there's a detour, but the detour is going to take you back eventually to the same road, right? So it's not a permanent change in the church's life. It's not a permanent departure. It's a temporary thing which still fulfills the same goal, which is to stay on the path of salvation. It's still salvation. There's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, God forbid we'd ever lose the sense and the application of economia in the church. We argue in the book that far from denying the ability and the right and the power of the bishop and the priest to practice and carry out economia, we argue that it's essential that the church understands that that's exactly what is happening in the church's life in many ways, including the question of reception. Another way to talk about economia would be that, and they talk about it in the church fathers, is that you have the exactitude of the canon, a particular canon that the church issues and says, this is how you deal with this topic. And usually it's pastoral problems of Orthodox Christians in the church with particular sins or departures that the church is now coming to correct. And they say, this is how you deal with this, okay? And then also there's the question of like how to apply it in confession, how the priest or the confessor is going to apply the gospel truth and standard to the very, very different circumstances of each human being and to bring them to the same goal of salvation in different ways. So somebody could come and say, let's just take the classic example in the ancient church. Saint Basil says, for abortion in his day, he recommends, as others do, that the person who committed the abortion be kept from Holy Communion. If this was an Orthodox Christian, obviously, who was living the life of the church and they fell into the sin, they'd be kept from Holy Communion for many, many years, sometimes to their deathbed. And of course, the person was in the life of the church. They weren't kicked out, but they had to have this penance. Later on, St. John the Faster or St. Nicodemus the Holy Mountain or other people will come and say the number of years is not the important part, it's the repentance. And you can see that in the Desert Fathers, for example, as well. How long does it take for someone to be restored? It could be in a nighttime of deep weeping and sorrow, as says Pambo, Saint, a great ascetic of the desert. So the time is not in the acrivia, it's in the economia, it's in the application of the rule, which is repentance, right? So the important part is the repentance and the return. And there's different ways for that to come about. St. Basil said so many years, another saint might say so many years, or another saint like St. John the Faster might say that they repent and they carry out a strict ascetic struggle, fasting and prayer, much, much fewer years or months, but much more intense ascetically. So the same therapy is being applied. That's the goal, right? So obviously in the life of the church, there's going to be a lot of application of so-called economia, the management of the household. It's actually the way we operate on a daily basis. Now, coming to the question of reception of converts, of people coming from heresy outside the church to the church, we see it first in the writings of St. Basil the Great. St. Basil the Great, in his first canon, what's called his first canon, letter to St. Amphilocios, and his 47th, when he's answering these pastoral problems. And he uses the term economia. And he says, he laid down the teaching of the church, which of course is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. He cites St. Cyprian, who came before him, and St. Firmilian, his predecessor, who absolutely forbid any recognition per se of the mysteries of the heretics. There's only the church and the church's mysteries. He cites that, and approvingly, some people want to imagine that he cited it and then rejected it, which would be absurd because he's following his predecessors who are saints and revered. He's not going to cite them and then reject them. And so he's showing us the acrivia, the exactitude of what is understood in terms of the nature of the church, the identity of the church, the identity of what is heresy. But then he says some fathers in Asia, what he means is probably Asia Minor, they've judged that in these cases there could be economia and they could be received without repeating or performing the baptism. But then you go to understand properly St. Basil, you have to see the entirety of his teaching. And Canon 47 is very important in this. Canon 47, I'm going to read to you. I've done a bunch of videos on this. But to properly understand economia, I think you really have to understand St. Basil, first of all, because he's the most revered, the most off-cited church father, and he's the one who actually gives us the interpretive key to understanding economia. St. Augustine, blessed though he be, is not cited, is not revered. There are no canons from St. Augustine in the ecumenical councils. There's one canon from a council that took place in Carthage, but it can be interpreted, I think, in the context also as an economia. But in any case, he's not looked to as the church father who's going to give us the understanding of economia. Certainly St. Basil is, and his 47th canon is very instructive. And it really does make it impossible for the church to accept the Augustinian ideas and St. Basil's 47th canon. They're irreconcilable. So the interpretive key cannot be Augustinian. It has to be Basilian or St. Basil. And I think you'll understand after I read the canon here. And the canon is on page 90 of our book, if somebody has the book and wants to cite it.
And here's the book. It's on the reception of the heterodox into the Orthodox Church, the patristic consensus and criteria.
Yes. So in Canon 47, St. Basil confirms the teaching of the heretics and schismatics should be baptized despite the fact that they baptize in the name of the Holy Trinity. And despite the fact that Rome, the church in Rome at the time, had forbidden their reception by baptism. So that's really amazing because that would never have been accepted in North Africa or in certainly post-schism Rome. So St. Basil again states that baptizing all heretics follows the acrivia, the exactitude. So the norm, the practice, the universal practice is all heretics coming to the church. And today, all of those who are outside the church who are coming in are in the category of heretics. There's only maybe the old calendarist groups or some other groups that are very recent would be considered schismatics. all the other ones, all various Catholic and I call papal and Reformed Protestant sectarians are going to be received by as heretics. And so for them, the Ecclesia is baptizing. And he says that baptizing all heretics follows the Ecclesia of the canons, while Rome's position was that of economia. So it's very interesting because he says what they're doing in Rome, from his perspective, is a temporary departure, particular application of the canons. It's not a rule. It's not a standard. It's not the way we should understand things as per se, but it's an exception. And it's some particular pastoral need they have there. And there's some criteria that they have there. And that, of course, would not have been adopted by people who are following certainly the post-schism Latin West, but probably even many in his day in Rome. Because I don't think I've ever heard the term, anything like the term expressed in this context in Latin writings like it's an economia. So he says, regarding particular heretics, which, by the way, are not unlike the Novatians, who were considered, let's see, I bring that up because I wanted to talk about that too. But in any case, we'll get back to that. That's another question. As for the Encratites, the Sacophori, and the Apoctites, these are various heretical groups. They're basically Gnostics in terms of their theology. He says, we baptize. The translation is we rebaptize such persons. So that's very interesting because, of course, we don't believe in rebaptism.
Right.
There's only one baptism. So what does he mean we rebaptize? Well, he says basically, like St. Cyril of Jerusalem says, we baptize only the heretics because their baptism is no baptism. That's St. Cyril of Jerusalem. So what he means here is we don't recognize their baptism, and we're going to baptize.
Right.
Even though they, again, were not the kind of heretics that impacted the Trinitarian or Christological theology. They were Gnostics, as you'll see in the canon, and that they were doing it, as he says in the canon, properly. Triple immersion and the names of the Trinity. Later on in Latin theology, again, we're heavily impacted by Latin theology today in our thinking among many of the converts who come into the church, because they talk about, well, if the form is there, if the names are used, if water is used, then it's a baptism and we cannot repeat it. That's a Latin post-schism idea. That's not in Canon 47 at all, as you'll see.
Right.
If it be objected that what we are doing is forbidden as regards this practice of rebaptism, precisely as in the case of the present day Romans, for the sake of economy, right? So he says, okay, they're doing some economy in Rome, and the people will tell you that what we're doing, baptizing all these heretics, is forbidden. He says, if that's said, we nonetheless insist that our rule prevail, since inasmuch and precisely as it is an offshoot of the Marcionites, a heresy of those who abominate marriage and who shun wine and who call God's creation tainted. So these are not Trinitarian heretical teachings, right? These are questions of moral, ethical, ascetic life. And he's saying they're blaspheming God through their teachings. We therefore, he goes on, do not admit them into the church unless they get baptized with our baptism. For let them not say that they are baptized in Father and Son and Holy Spirit, who assume God to be a bad creator, in a manner vying with the Marcionites and other heresies. So he says, yeah, they use the names. Yeah, they have their baptism, because baptism is, in this context, would have been immersion, right? That's what the word means.
Right,
the word doesn't, or sprinkling. There's other words for that. There's dispersion. There's other words in Greek for that. This means immersion. So he's saying, yes, they're immersing them. Yes, they're using the names of the Trinity. And only on the basis of their terrible teachings with regard to nature and morality, we reject that they could be truly baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity. So this is totally at odds with all contemporary ecumenist and Latin theories around this question, right? And nobody ever talks about Canon 47 on the other side of this question.
Right.
They just never talk about it because they can't.
Yeah.
They can't do anything with it. He goes on. So that if this pleases them, more bishops ought to adopt it. So he's not only telling us, do this, he's saying, get all the other bishops together in a council and let's adopt this. And thus establish as a canon in order that anyone following should be in no danger and anyone replying by citing it shall be deemed worthy of credence. So he says it's really important for this to be solidified considerably in council, which is always the Orthodox approach to this matter. It's always a synodical question. But there's no doubt the church embraced this because they took this canon and the other canon, talking about economy, and they put it in the collection of canons in Trullo, and they said these canons are God-inspired, and we follow the teachings of these holy fathers. So it's extremely important to understand that economia is a temporary departure. It's never a rule. It cannot be cited as, oh, they did it in the 8th century, did this, therefore we'll do this. That's not how we operate as Orthodox. So the question is, what is the criteria? On what basis do we employ economia? Like, is it just, I just as a priest or a bishop sit up and say, I think I'll depart from the norm here. I think I'll not apply it because that's my idea. Do we do that, or do we have criteria laid down by the fathers? And we do have criteria laid down by the fathers. There's very particular criteria. And the fathers that have dealt with this, the only fathers that have dealt with this at length are the fathers of the 18th century in the Patriarchate of Constantinople, on Mount Athos and elsewhere, mainly St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. St. Paisios Velichkovsky had the same exact position. He worked with a co-worker and a close disciple of his, Dorotheos Voulusmas, who was from the Patriarchate of Constantinople in the late 18th century. He worked with St. Athanasius of Paros, a very important church father. A lot of people don't know about him. And the consensus that was then imparted into the canonical collection of texts, which was approved by the church and translated in all the languages at the time, the so-called Pedalian or rudder, that position, which you can find in the commentary of St. Nicodemus on the relevant canons, is that for those heretics to be received, if there's a need, so first of all, there's a need to depart from the gospel and the ecclesia, right? If there's a need,
right?
Pastoral need, and in all the canons, by the way, including the canons surrounding such things as the novations in the 1st century, and why there seems to be a difference in terms of the 1st and 2nd ecumenical councils. We can get into that if you want to. That's a very important issue. St. Nicodemus explains everything in terms of economia and ecclesia. And so the criteria that St. Nicodemus talks about in terms of the Latin, in other words, Western baptism in the 18th century, which is what's already in place, the same thing they're doing and worse today, right? They're even more innovating and departing, but they're already departed from baptism immersion in the 18th century. So he says, look, they've departed from the form. They departed from the external thing, that the only thing that heretics have is the external thing. They don't have, as we said here, St. Basil approves of the ecclesiology of St. Cyprian and St. Firmilian, and he clearly has it again when in Canon 47, when he denies some kind of need not to baptize. There's clearly no pressure or some kind of requirement upon the church, the bishops, to not baptize ever. Like, the bishops are always free to baptize, obviously, because that's the ecclesia, that's the exactitude. So if there's a need, they wouldn't do that. And then if they have fulfilled or kept the form, then they would be able to do something called economia in this case, right? They would be able to depart from the ecclesia. So St. Nicodemus says, well, unfortunately, from the Council of Trent onward for quite some time now, in the West, they've departed wholesale, and they've doubled down on it, and they've declared it that they're not baptizing. They're now going to just pour water over the forehead. That's what they've been doing for hundreds of years. That's not baptism. That's not the form of baptism, and that should not be received. There should be no economia. And the basic reason is because if you start to economize, and again, economia is a temporary departure for a particular need. That's not what's happening today. People are departing at the rule, and they're doing it across the board. And they're doing it for reasons which are not even pastoral. They're doing it because they have different ideas of the mysteries, different ideas about the church. And so it's really a question of ecclesiology in many cases. But St. Nicodemus says there's no basis for economy. We must baptize them because they've departed from even that which they had, which was the external form. And again, it would be, they make the case, it undermines the very mystery. If you, on a wholesale level, are receiving people who are converting from these groups and they don't even have the external form of the mystery, then you're undermining the very theology of the mystery. And that's what's happened in the West, right? They don't practice and live out the theology of the mystery when they baptize, right? What they're doing, and these are theologians in Catholicism, they'll tell you that. They say the form of immersion, the form of baptism is where you see the theology of the church. What is that? That you die and rise. And you do it 3 times in the name of the Trinity. And that is a new life, a new creation. The very practice teaches us the theology, right? So when you abandon the practice, you eventually lose the theology as well. And you get into a very minimalistic and legalistic understanding of this mystery. And it's very obvious today that that's what's happened. You've got Protestants who don't even think you need to be baptized. You have many, many Protestants who think it's just a symbol. Nothing changes. All of that is, of course, connected to the historical departure from the triple immersion and from the theology that goes along with it. So you have no basis for economia today. That's the main problem. Yes, of course, the church can economize. As I said, it's essential and it's integral to the church's life that there's economy and that the bishops can economize. It's the carrying out and the practicing and the implementation of salvation. But it's not economia. In other words, it's not salvific when there's no need and there's no basis, there's no form, there's not even the external reality there that's going on. It's a mockery of theology of the church.
Well, there's no grace unless it's in the Orthodox Church, right? So I mean, it's just like, if it doesn't matter if it's in the form or if it's a triple immersion or full, it doesn't matter if it doesn't have the Orthodox priest who has the divine grace of God for that mystery to happen, right?
Well, so that's the acrivia, the exactitude. So St. Nicodemus says on both cases, with regard to the Latins at the time, he says whether you look at it in terms of acrivia, in other words, there's only one mystery, it's only in the church, they don't have it because they teach heresy and they're not in the church. So from the get-go, on the terms of acrivia, exactitude, there's no mysteries. But if there was to be an economia, on what basis would we do it? We would do it because there's a great need and there's the form. And that doesn't even exist. So he says on both cases, on both counts, there's no basis to receive except by baptism. And so if we're going to follow the Holy Fathers who've dealt with this, and these are the saints who dealt with it. Some people say, well, St. Nicodemus, the Athenites. Look, if you've got another group of saints who are approved by the church, who wrote on this and taught on this and presented it in depth, show me. I don't know of any other group of saints that have been approved by the church and embraced, and their teachings were embraced for hundreds of years. And the very document they produced was accepted across the Orthodox world and cited. I mean, is there something more authoritative? No. And some people now are trying to go back to canonists in the 14th and the 15th century, but none of them deal with it to the depth and in terms of ecclesiology as well, right? What is the church, the identity of the church, and with regard to the contemporary situation. So all those three things point us to the Colivadis Fathers, to St. Nicodemus, and to, again, the ecumenical patriarchate of the day, which totally embraced these views. And now there's an attempt, I mean, we can go into all kinds of rabbit trails here, but now there's an attempt to say St. Nicodemus really didn't believe that, and he wrote something he didn't believe, which is nonsense, and that's all been shown to be nonsense. But they're doing whatever they can to undermine this clear teaching of the ecumenists. I mean, in our midst, they're trying to undermine this clear teaching so that we have the idea, the sense that, hey, we're all together, we're all one.
Yeah, I mean, right.
That's what some who've been confused by ecumenism are doing. Now, there are others who are very sincere Orthodox priests and bishops who are not ecumenists, but they get this. They do not understand it in this way, and they think that, well, these presuppositions don't exist. Basically, the bishop is free to do it as he likes. There's no real consensus among the fathers as to the need and the presupposition. I think, God bless them, they're wrong. We showed them that they're wrong in the book, 450 pages. That's not just a consensus, and it's not pastorally discerning when you have this grave heresy at your door. Right. So if you think, well, the bishop should be free to do whatever he likes, there's no precedent, there's no presuppositions, which is, I think, wrong. But even if you did, discernment would tell you, in this context, in this climate today, with so much heretical ideas in terms of the identity of the church, we shouldn't be economizing. It's unwise. It undermines the identity of the church, undermines the boundary between heresy and orthodoxy, and it's being taken advantage of by people who are clearly not teaching an orthodox ecclesiology. So there's, at least naive for someone to say, it doesn't matter if we chrismate or baptized today. They've not looked into the matter.
Right. You've so clearly explained economia is the exception. It's not, it's become the rule. And as somebody who was a Protestant convert into Orthodoxy, and I was told that my Protestant baptism, it had the form or whatever. And once you enter the church, it's like the Augustinian belief that, once you enter the church, the grace of that baptism will activate or whatever. But what Saint Cyprian says, as I was reading the chapter in the book, he says, "For if heretics shall see that it is determined and decreed by our judgment and sentence that the baptism wherewith they are there baptized is considered just and legitimate, they will think that they are justly and legitimately in possession of the church also, and the other gifts of the church, nor will there be any reason for their coming to us, when as they have baptism, they seem also to have the rest." So if that baptism in the Protestant church or the Catholic church is valid, why leave? And then in the rest of the quote, he says, "But further, when they know there is no baptism and that no remission of sins can be given outside the church, they are more eagerly and readily hasten to us and implore the gifts and benefits of our church, of the church our mother, assured that they can in no wise attain to the true promise of divine grace unless they first come into the truth of the church." So it's if you have this belief that, the baptism was fine in the Protestant church or the Catholic church, then you don't have any reason to leave. The other sacraments should be fine. But when you realize that baptism didn't have the sacraments, it didn't have the divine grace, as a convert, it makes you even more eager. I want to take communion where it's a real communion in the Orthodox church. I want the sacraments of the Orthodox church because it has the divine grace. So
absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of theories in the 20th century, especially 19th, 20th century, a lot of theories that have been created to try to describe or explain this practice of economy. So there's two streams coming down to us that have confused us, I think, today. One is just an outright departure from Orthodox ecclesiology and theology under the influence of scholastic and Western ideas. That definitely impacted the church in the 17th and 18th century. The saints were consciously fighting against that, the great Kolivadis fathers. So there's no doubt that happened. And St. Father Florovsky of blessed memory has a whole book on the Western captivity. And so it's a real thing. Now, it doesn't mean that everything was corrupted and there's not piety and there's not saints. That would be extreme. But that it did impact academic theology and the teaching of the faith to many, many people over the last few hundred years, it's absolutely the case. And we're reeling from it to this day. And so we have these theories that come in to try to explain our departure from certain practices or what economy is. But there are theories that are basically not based in the patristic teaching. They're not really repeating or showing us the patristic mind. They're just theories, ideas. Well, maybe this is what we mean. So you hear this idea the chrismation is something that fills what was lacking in the baptism.
Yeah.
Fills what was lacking. Or you have this idea that, no matter what happened, whether there was a departure from the teaching or the practice of the church, doesn't matter. Grace covers everything. The church, the grace of the church just covers everything.
I've heard that one.
Now, these are pious attempts at trying to explain them, what obviously is something hard to explain. I don't blame the people trying to explain it this way, but we should really stick closely to what the fathers teach and not just say things that are nice and sound good. And somebody wrote them in, the 60s or the 80s in some academic theologian, because that's what a lot of this is. The idea, for instance, which is very common today, I think it comes from Christos Ware, who took it from Evdokimov. And it's this idea, well, we know where the church is, we don't know where the church is not. And so that's absurd. Of course, we know where the church is and where it's not. The church has always known who Christ is and where Christ is not. I mean, this is really basic. And so they're trying to take something which is a little legitimate, which is we know where the Holy Spirit is active. We cannot say where it's not active. Even that needs unpacking. We kind of know we'll know that too. But yeah, there's a mystery as how the Holy Spirit is working outside the church and in creation. Absolutely at work to bring everybody to salvation. Absolutely. But you can't take the Holy Spirit's work and make it into a Christological or a ecclesiological statement. And now talk about the identity of the church as somehow fluid or not very clear, right? The Holy Spirit is working all of creation. What happens in the mysteries is not the same divine energy that's in all of creation. It's very clear in the teachings of the fathers like Saint Maximus that there's one thing outside and another thing when you come to the threshold of the church. That's why when the saints are talking about no grace outside the church, they mean no mysteries, no grace of the mysteries, because they presuppose someone coming to the church, repenting, being catechized, being initiated. It's so basic. Like if you don't teach what we're presenting right here, if you go into the realm of this ecumenist, confusion, it doesn't. Why would you even do catechism anymore? Or why do we catechize people who've already been baptized or already ordained or already communing of the mysteries? Because there's people today who say that Catholicism has the Eucharist. Well, if Catholicism has the Eucharist, then it has Christ, it has the church, it's everything. And why would we catechize them and initiate them at all? Why not just declare union?
Yeah, just chrismate. Just get them started.
Yeah, just unite at that point if they have the Eucharist. I mean, so there's a lot of 20th century confusion. We have to be careful. What we're saying is actually based in the patristic teaching, strictly in the patristic teaching. And so this war against economia, which there's a war among certain quarters that don't want to accept the economic explanation of our practice, is basically circling the wagons around an ecclesiology that is not the patristic ecclesiology, but it's an ecclesiology that's been formed over the last few hundred years, and it does not stand the test of scrutiny against the patristic mind, the patristic teaching as to the nature of the church. So they're reeling from the clear realization that, wait a minute, that does not stand. Like, this practice does not stand. We've been doing this wrong. And now we've got to double, triple down and create these theories to explain what we've been doing and justify it. So, for instance, in several local Orthodox churches in the last 200 years, and this is, again, why do we go back to the Colivades fathers and the saints of the 18th century? Because they were already dealing with this. It was already a departure. They were already facing the implications and the impact of the Western heretical ideas about baptism and mysteries and the boundaries in the 18th century. And so they were already saying, St. Paisius Veskovsky was writing to his disciple, Ulismas, asking him to do a treatise. He was absolutely forbidding any of the heretics who were coming in, including the Unions, to be chrismated. He baptized them all. Why were they doing that already in 1800, basically? Because it was already happening. And we already seen a departure among the Orthodox into a bad practice with regard to baptism. So you have people in local churches in Bulgaria or in Serbia or in Russia who, under the influence of either great ignorance or a Latin ecclesiology or sacramental theology, started to do what the Latins did. And they started to pour instead of immerse, or even less. Aspersion, but mainly pouring. But basically the Latin practice. And when I've been to Serbia, I've been to, several times. I've been to the feast of Saint Basil of Ostrog. I was coming down from the mountain there, and I encounter the bishops on the right here, the ever memorable Metropolitan Amphilochius, I was his guest, and we were there. And on the left, I saw people standing under a tree, 4 or 5 people, and a priest baptizing them like the Latins baptized, like just water over their forehead. And I'm thinking to myself, what is going on? This is insane, because Metropolitan Amphilochius was, of course, a great disciple of Saint Justin Popovic, who clearly taught that that's not what we should be doing. He was a great dogmatic theologian. He clearly did not agree with that practice. Neither did Metropolitan Amphilochius, for that matter. But this had become inertia for 100, 150 years of people in ignorance, and now it's become a way, and now they don't want to say, wait, this is a bad practice. But I met people in Serbia who were working against that. They were struggling against that. They were trying to do proper Orthodox triple immersion, and they were getting warred against by their own fellow clergymen. And you're like, why? Why would this priest? I mean, I talked to him at length in the diocese there under Metropolitan Irene, and he was like, I get warred against, and I get really called out by my fellow priests. I said, why? He said, well, they feel like it's a threat to them, that their own mysteries or their own baptism or their practices are now called into question if you say this is how we baptize. And so now it's a personal issue.
Yep.
Now they're taking it personal. Like, are you calling us into question on how we should be received, how we should be taught? And, we can get into theories about what does it mean, the implications. I'm not the responsible party to try to figure out all the implications. That's the churches in council, right? The church in council have to determine what this all means pastorally, if it means what it means. But we don't have to go there. We just need to go back to faithfulness. We know that the church didn't teach that and didn't practice that. That's not what the ecumenical councils consider baptism. There's canon upon canon calling for the triple immersion, and some even calling for the deposition of a priest who doesn't triple immerse. So there's no question here that that's what we do as Orthodox, and we've always done it. Let's return. Let's just get back to what it means to do a proper Orthodox baptism. Instead of justifying further departures, laxity, the grace will cover it over, it fills what is lacking. These are theories that are nice, pious theories to try to figure out our practice. Instead, what we should do is say, let's be faithful today. Let's start in doing what the church taught in the ecumenical councils and in the Holy Fathers. And let's not leave any more room for confusion, doubt, and possible implications in the spiritual life of the people. And I would say this, it's one thing to understand, what does it mean? Some people say, well, what do you mean? What are you saying, Father? Are you saying these people aren't baptized? I'll say this, and I think this is very basic in pastoral theology and canon law. If I, a simple, sinful human being who's a priest, make a mistake in baptism or the Eucharist or whatever, or the bishop makes a mistake in the ordination or whatever, absolutely, there's no doubt that we can say that the human frailty is covered by the grace of God. It says that in the ordination in so many words. But if I decide and I legislate and I practice again and again and again something that was never handed down by the Holy Fathers, it was never taught in the Holy Canons, it was criticized and rejected by church fathers, and it's been codified in our canon law, as in the Pedalion, and on. If I do that and I double down and triple down and I say, no, we're going to continue this practice of sprinkling or pouring or receiving without the need or the presuppositions, if I do that, well, then on what basis do I have this confidence that the grace will cover my sins or my practice, when I'm consciously saying I don't care, or I've adopted a Latin idea and I say this is an Orthodox idea? I don't think there's any confidence here. There shouldn't be any confidence that, hey, it's all right, it doesn't matter. God will not be mocked, and he's not going to become obedient to people who don't try to be faithful to him. This is about faithfulness. It's not about some form, external. Yes, it's also that. It's both and, right? It's both external and internal. But it's really at the heart of it is faithfulness. And when we have faithfulness, we absolutely have spiritual progress and enrichment and depth. When we have a superficial justification because of XYZ, because of my personal circumstances, or what are you implying, or all this stuff that you see, people take it very personal. And then it's in the realm of the passion. It's not in the realm of some frailty. It's a conscious decision not to follow the teachings of the Holy Fathers. I think it's very, very serious what's going on.
Yeah.
And we all take these things very seriously and not just wave them off. Oh, yeah. And I welcome countering the book, countering the discussion, taking apart arguments. There are people who've come out and criticized the book, but there's never been a serious debate or discussion. I asked somebody a couple of days ago, let's talk about it. He said, no, I don't have a blessing. Okay, that's fine. When will we actually discuss really basic and important matters? And why are we running from it? What are we afraid of, and what's the agenda?
Yeah,
what I see
exactly.
What I see is people missing. Oh, that's stupid. But okay, well, let's see. No, we don't see serious engagement. I'm ready. Let's do it. Let's do some serious engagement on the basis of the church's teachings. Let's see somebody actually explain to me how contemporary practice and the Latin sacramentology can be reconciled with Canon 47 of Saint Basil.
Right.
It's not possible.
No, absolutely. And it seems like you also mentioned Father George. That's not what I want to mention. I wanted to talk about how this feels like it's part of the ecumenist movement, and is like a fault, like by saying that we can accept the Catholic baptism, or that you can accept the Protestant baptism, and let's just bring everybody together. It's all what's happening with this economia thing and baptism. It really just feels like the ecumenist movement to me, like the agenda behind that.
It could be. There's two groups. They're not all in the same camp or mindset. There are those who are sincere, blessed Orthodox people who just don't understand the presuppositions and the need and what economy presupposes. And they think it's a free for all. It doesn't matter. Just do it. The bishop's in charge. He'll take it. Whatever the bishop says. And obviously the bishop has great leeway. He's the apostle, and other bishops have to call them out when they depart, and there needs to be church councils. It's not possible for us, laymen or priests, to correct bishops, at least not directly. They need to be on the level of the episcopate. But the idea that, and we saw this during COVID, that we can rest assured that the bishop or priest is, making an error, and we know he's making an error, but we just blindly are obedient on matters, especially, of course, dogmatic or touching on our salvation, and we don't have to worry that this is going to impact us spiritually or we're going to have to give an account. That's not true. Actually, that's not true, because it's so obvious that it's not true in many ways. Because if you go to a doctor and the doctor says, I'm going to give you this medicine, and this medicine actually ends up making me worse and making me sicker, you're not going to say, well, this is on the doctor. You're going to say, well, that's actually impacting me. He gave me the bad medicine and I'm getting sick. I'm not going to continue to blindly follow this doctor. He's a bad doctor, right?
Right.
That's how in the world, that's how it's in doctor. So the spiritual doctor, yes, of course, we need to be obedient to our spiritual father and our bishops, absolutely, on all matters except dogmatic matters that touch on our salvation. Right. If they've departed from the church's teaching, the fathers, the councils, and they do not follow, it's not a matter of indifference to us. We are co-responsible. We can't the blind leading the blind, the Lord talks about in the gospel. So it's extremely important that we all feel this as a common concern. It's touching on the salvation of the world. It's touching on the identity of the church, which is touching on the salvation of the world. And yes, we're not going to solve it, in any kind of democratic way, or we're going to rebel, or we're going to go into schism. Obviously, none of that will solve any of these problems. And each one has their role. The bishops, again, have to ultimately in council decide on this. But until that point, you have many examples in church history of clergymen, of laymen, who fought the good fight for the sake of patristic orthodoxy. And they weren't bishops, and they didn't, call into question the episcopacy, but their witness was extremely impactful. I'm thinking of somebody like Khomyakov, for instance, in Russia, or any number of simple monks on Mount Athos during the 18th century, or St. Maximus the Confessor, who was a simple monk, or on and on. So we're all co-responsible for this question of the identity of Christ. Ultimately, it's about who Christ is. It's about how do we are we incorporated into Christ? It's not a question of, some external form. Like somebody said, well, I don't understand why, you're going to insist on the form. I don't see that in church history. It's not a question of form alone. It's a question of faithfulness, fidelity, and the nature of economy, which touches on salvation, touches on our salvation.
Well, it's not when it comes to the form, it's not the form of the baptism that cleanses the soul. It's the grace, correct? It's the divine grace that comes to the priest. And so kind of thinking of that, if somebody is coming in as a Protestant convert by economia and they're just being chrismated, what are the implications that could possibly happen to them on their walk of salvation from there on. And also, if somebody is baptized, because I know a lot of churches don't even have like adult size fonts to baptize converts when they come in. So they're having aspersion baptisms. Is there a consequence for the person that's being baptized? Like, is it going to be more difficult for them, or like what can we talk
about? I don't know how to answer you as I'm not a great elder or a spiritual father that has charismatic experiences and can see, like Elder Ephraim can see whether somebody has a guardian angel or not. And he, is attested by many people to have that discernment, that gift, as did Saint Iacovos of Evia or Saint Porphyrios or Elder Emilianos or any number of other great contemporary holy men. I don't have that. So I can't talk about from personal experience about how that's impacting people's spiritual life. I can say that the canons of the church, when there is a question as to whether someone has been baptized as a child, we have two canons actually accepted at Trullo, one from Carthage, another that's accepted at Trullo. They both say the same thing, and that is that if there's doubt as to whether someone's been baptized as a child, there was nobody there to witness it, of course the child didn't know, then they should be baptized. So the church in council, in canons, doesn't play with the possibility of someone not being baptized. They say baptize them if there's doubt. That's very interesting, right? And so there is such a thing as a baptism after reception, obviously, if that in that case, right? They were received and have been communing from childhood, and yet the canon says if there's doubt to their baptism, baptize them. And for instance, ROCOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Bishop Luke has said this to me personally, but I've seen it also in the writings of the late Bishop Peter, that they had that understanding that if there was some reason to doubt the baptism that had taken place in somebody's childhood or whatever, that they had. The bishop, of course, would have to bless it, but they could go ahead and say, do the mystery as if it's never been done. The Latins have an idea, which is we don't share, which is this something like a, conditional baptism. That's a Latin legalistic kind of approach to things. But in any case, it's not unknown in the West. I would say, judging generally, this is just speculative, I'm speculating here, but I would say judging generally, if we know that this has been a problem for 200 years, at least 200 years in the Orthodox East. In other words, what's the problem? The impact of bad practices and bad theology from the West on our own practices, such that the Holy Fathers of Mount Athos already in the 18th century, in the 1830s, as attested to in the famous memoirs or journal kept by a pilgrim came down from the Ukraine. I forget his name right now. A famous text. He kept. It's very historically important. He kept a journal from all his travels throughout the Middle East, in Jerusalem, and then in Mount Athos. And he comes to Mount Athos as one thoroughly impacted by Latin sacramentology and one who believes the kind of things that we're facing today already back in the 1700s. And he comes to Athos, and the Athonites are not only baptizing everyone coming from the West already in 1730, but they're even baptizing those Orthodox who've been improperly initiated. And he was totally, utterly scandalized. He was utterly scandalized because they had already bought into the idea that this is immaterial. It's unimportant whether you buy immersion or aspersion or pouring or whatever, it doesn't matter. So the Athonites, of course, were already facing this. So if it's true that we've been facing it for 200 years and we have a departure from Orthodox practice, of course, it goes along with a general secularization. It goes along with a general Latinization in our ecclesiology. It all goes together, right? These things are not, we absolutely believe in Orthodoxy that our theology impacts our life and our life impacts our theology. So if that's the case, then, and we look at the world and the state of the world and the gross secularization of the world, maybe they're connected. Maybe the one has impacted and led to the other. I don't see why we wouldn't see the connections. In other words, the Father St. Rose talks about the evaporation or the loss of the grace of God. That's ultimately what will pave the way for the rise of Antichrist, he says. That's the question. Do we have the grace or not? of the mysteries and of the. So without the grace of God, we can do nothing. Without the grace of God, we can't understand or move or go deeper in our relationship with Christ. We lose sight of who he is and all the rest. So if the grace of God is, and so that's the enemy's number one goal, is that we do not enjoy the grace of God through the passions, through the laziness, but also through dogmatic error, which is the worst kind of demon, right? Of heresy.
Right.
If that's the enemy's goal, and he's been successful in that over the last few hundred years, and we see that corresponds to a general laxity with regard to these very basic matters in terms of the proper understanding of the mysteries, the proper living out of the faith. Of course, again, it's all connected. It's not just some legalistic thing. They stopped doing X in 1750, and that's why. No, of course, it's a question of faithfulness. That's why I keep going back. It's not a question of form. It's a question of faithfulness. And so it's impossible for us at this point, if we understand what's going on, to be indifferent to this question. It's not a legalistic question. It's a question of faithfulness. I can't stress that enough, that to avoid this tendency. What is the tendency? Find the exception. Find the example that I can prove that it doesn't matter. Father Seraphim Rose was received by chrismation, therefore anybody can become a saint. It doesn't matter. That's a very superficial approach to the question of what happened to Father Seraphim. What happened? There's a great answer for all that. We've given it in our writings and in our texts and in our live streams, and it does not at all undermine faithfulness to the church's teaching on baptism. But if you want to find exceptions to the rule, point to them, and then have a kind of not guilty conscience that I don't have to deal with this issue anymore. It doesn't matter. You can do that. You can find those, and you can feel like this is not important. But the church canons, the church fathers, definitely tell us that it is very, very important to be faithful to these things.
Yeah, I that's such a good point, about and how that ties to the grace, leaving the church over time, and then when the grace is gone, and then the Antichrist is in place of, once that seems like that's emptied out. But bring up Father Seraphim Rose, that he's one example that's often used to support economia when bringing a convert in. And I was reading up on Seraphim Rose, and he baptized converts that came in, right? When he was baptizing, and he's quoted saying, "Of course, Roman Catholics and a few other groups do consider themselves to have sacraments. I myself would say that the true sacraments, in the sense of that Christ founded them, are to be found only in the Orthodox Church." He also says the Church of Christ is that which gives grace to people. And in the West, when Rome broke off from this church, this grace was actually lost. So what would you have to say when somebody wants to bring up Seraphim Rose just being chrismated as the exception of the rule, and so everybody else should just be chrismated? But then it's like Father Seraphim Rose was baptizing converts, and he didn't believe that there was grace outside of the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, so the practice of the Russian Church at the time, which was the same practice going back several hundred years, which was, this is what we should look at. We shouldn't look at only what they did in the terms of Father Seraphim. We should look at whether this practice was the patristic practice, is the patristic practice. That's the first question. And that's the most important that you have to answer. You don't answer these questions piecemeal, after the fact, at the end of history. That's why the book went back from the beginning and came all the way down to our day. And then you see it in the proper context. In other words, you start with Christology, and then you go to ecclesiology, and then you go to pastoral application of the canons, and you look at the Economia as the last step in the whole. And it's always in the context of Orthodox ecclesiology and based on it. So coming to Father Seraphim Rose, they were in the best case scenario understanding, they were basically applying economia. They had been doing it for a long time in the Russian Church. Now, I don't know how the Church Fathers, Bishop Tikhon, who baptized him in San Francisco, St. John did not baptize him, Bishop Tikhon did. I don't know how he understood it. I don't know if he even examined it. I don't know if they ever discussed this matter. I think for many saints, we have many saints who were simple and they accepted whatever the church was handing down to them. Doesn't mean that they actually had a thoroughly informed understanding of the practice. I don't know. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But the best case scenario was that they said we're going to do economia here, which probably didn't happen because in the Russian church, the idea of economia was not really at the forefront. It was a Latin kind of sacramentology. And so he was charismated. And the question is, well, okay, so didn't that impact his spiritual life? I don't know. I can't tell you what God did with that. Now, the error of someone, because I think it is an error to receive somebody who's not been ever immersed, even externally, and without a need, I think it's an error to apply so-called economia if that's how they understood it. But the error of the bishop is not necessarily going to tie the hands of God for the rest of Father Seraphim's life, and the zeal and love of Father Seraphim certainly would count for a great deal. So I would say, in spite of the mistake, God worked within his life and clearly brought forth great fruit of sanctity. I think he's a saint of the church. He'll be made a saint of the church. So, and same with Grand Duchess Elizabeth. Of course, she was a martyr. Even if there, one could say, if there was a mistake in the error in her reception, she was martyred. And, there are many martyrs in church history who never were baptized. They were baptized in their blood. But with Father Seraphim, it's more, an obvious question because he was an ascetic. So I think the answer is the error, in spite of the error, God sanctified and brought him forward. So does that become a rule for us? No, exactly the opposite. St. Nicodemus says in his commentary on the canons, both the Apostolic and First Ecumenical Council, he says there that it's a matter of economy and necessity, and that is never a rule. In fact, he cites, I'll give you the particular phrase he says, whatever is contrary to the canons cannot be drawn upon as an example. And the temporary occurrence by economy is never a definite rule. It's rare, it's circumstantial, it's never a different rule. So even if we have an exception to the rule with Father Seraphim, even if, this didn't impact ultimately his sanctity, it's certainly not a rule. It's certainly not a justification for us to continue in something that's not the mind of the ecumenical councils. And it's very interesting that within just a few years, the whole of the Russian Church abroad changed its stance and said converts coming in should be baptized, and Father Seraphim baptized everyone. So in fact, they did exactly the opposite of what these people are doing today. They didn't use that as a good example to continue. They said, no, in fact, today with ecumenism and all these things, we must baptize everyone, which is exactly what we've been saying and what the saints have said for hundreds of years. So I don't think Father Seraphim's example somehow is some death blow to patristic understanding of economia and Corrective. I also want to say this before we close, is that, we produced a book, but it's not us writing up our opinions in there. It's us presenting the fathers. And so it's not Father Peter Heers and what he has to say. It's what Saint Nicodemus has to say, or the Council of Fathers, the patriarchs in 1755 and 56, or Saint Cosmas, and what he says about the need for immersion, or Canon 50, or Canon 47 of Saint Basil, or on and on, or Saint Luke, the physician who suspended his priests if they didn't triple immerse properly in his diocese in the 1930s and 40s. So there are many, many fathers that we have to listen to. It's not just an opinion of somebody like me or somebody in the last 10 or 15 years. This is a patristic teaching, and people have to confront that and come to terms with that, and not hand wave it off. It's really disappointing to see some serious people just kind of hand wave and say, oh, that's just that stupid priest. Yeah. Really? That's not very serious. I think we can be more serious and engage this. So a lot of stories in church history, but there are saints who definitely teach, Saint Cosmas at Delos, that insofar as you're negligent and you don't properly immerse, there will be consequences. Saint Cosmas teaches that. You can find that in the saints of the church. Yeah. We don't like to admit that kind of thing because we are generally lax. Right. Let's admit it. We're all lax. I'm lax. I don't fast as much as I could. I don't pray as much as I could. So I don't like to be called to account if I'm, very lax in the way I baptize people. That's not something I want people to do. Right. passions I don't enjoy that. So I think when we read people like Saint Cosmas or other saints that are very determined, like Saint Luke, the physician, it calls us out on our laxity with regard to proper baptismal form.
Yeah. It definitely seems like how Economia is seen today, especially with the reception of the heterodox, it is just it's moving far away from what the church fathers taught, what tradition was, what it always was, what Jesus taught. And that is exactly what created, I believe, like the problems in Christianity today with Protestantism and Catholicism. And it's just the further you stem away, it's just the further from the grace you get. And the whole reason I became Orthodox, a big part was that this was where the truth had been kept the same. So I hope that we can stick with that, and that more people, read this book, that you put together of the church fathers, what they said, and the saints, what they said. And like you said, these issues have already been dealt with all throughout time in the 1800s. This isn't anything new. And it's just, go ahead. It's just like, I just wanted to be like, just baptize like everyone. What's the problem? Like, just baptize everybody. This isn't, there's the Economia, like it's turning into like they're turning the exception into the rule. And it doesn't even make sense.
Again, there's two camps. One is a very sincere attempt to, follow the fathers, but I think mistaken. Another is a Cubanist mindset that is a different ecclesiology, which ultimately means it's a different Christ. Because if St. Paul can say about the Judaizers, they are preaching another gospel, and they simply wanted to maintain, the type, and they wouldn't receive it as the fulfillment in baptism. They wanted to keep the circumcision. And he says, look, you're preaching another gospel. Well, if we have another vision of the church, which is the body of Christ, that he is the head of the church, then we are in danger of preaching another gospel or really talking about a different kind of Christ. So when we pass over into heretical ecclesiologies, heretical ideas about the church per se, then we're in very, very dangerous waters, and we cannot remain indifferent no matter who you are. Layman, priest, you can't be indifferent. Now, what do you do? That's a whole nother podcast, but you can't be indifferent. You got to pray at least and have pain of heart and care about the truth. Let me just say one last thing before we end, because I know that there was there's a red herring, so to speak, that's always thrown out there, and I think maybe it's good just to comment on that, because some people call upon different exceptions in church history to somehow justify a very broad and all-encompassing economia, just kind of almost a wave, a wand. Economia is a wand waving, grace covers everything approach. I don't think that's patristic. I don't think the fathers talk like that or think like that. So sometimes people will cite certain things in ecumenical councils. One in particular is the First Ecumenical Council, which accepted novations with confession. People say, well, they were made priests without even being received by baptism or chrismation, let alone, being baptized. They weren't even chrismated. They were just received by confession of faith, the novations. But later on, of course, there was a much stricter application, including baptism by some. But in the Second Ecumenical Council, just 40, 50 years later, right, there was the reception of these same heretics by a sealing of chrismation. And the fathers said that they had abandoned even the chrismation, the form of chrismation. And so it's very interesting, because you see in that same council, I don't know if you're following, this is really important, the logic here. In the same council, the Second Ecumenical Council, they insist on the Eunomians being baptized because they had abandoned the form of baptism. In other words, economia is not possible when the heretics destroy the form of the mystery. The novations in the Second Ecumenical Council had departed from the proper chrismation. They were chrismated upon reception. There was an economy, but they were chrismated. The Eunomians had departed from baptism. There was no economy for them. They had to be received by baptism because the very form of baptism had been abandoned. So what's the point here? The point is that if the heretics in our day have totally abandoned even the form, there's no basis for economia.
Right.
That's the logic that the saints have given us. If you actually read St. Nicodemus, he goes through all of this. He explains why the church fathers did it in each case. And so instead of a magic wand of economia, there's actually a very clear rationale among the fathers why they did what they did in each circumstance. And it's not a precedent for us today. We don't appeal to what happened in the 3rd century as a precedent.
Right.
We actually apply the mind of the church to each case. And today, to apply it in our day and age means we baptize. That's what it means. And that's the following the very same stance of the first and second and ecumenical council and Trullo. And people cite Canon 95, for instance, in Trullo. Well, Canon 95 says all other heretics should be baptized, which means that only the heretics enumerated should be received by Economia. And even that, and then people might talk about the Monophysites, but the Monophysites were actually at the end of the canon. They were incorporated in that group which is baptized. That's a whole other question that people have yet to even encounter, really, because that's a whole other question. But anyway, the point is, when there are no presuppositions for Economia, because they've abandoned even the form, there is not the blessing. There's not the blessing to go ahead and proceed with Economia, because you're undermining the very mystery by doing that. And you're calling into question whether someone's been properly baptized. If the church fathers in Trullo said, if you doubt they've been baptized as by Orthodox when they were children, baptize them, how much more should we baptize those who are heretics if we know that they haven't been immersed?
Exactly.
It doesn't follow. What we're doing today does not follow the patristic mind.
Right. And I just wanted to touch on this just because we've been talking for a while and I want to make sure that it's said in here. But some people will say, well, they wouldn't baptize me when I came in because it would be a rebaptism. Rebaptism, that you can't do that. That's not supposed to be done. That's a horrible thing. But rebaptism would only be if somebody was baptized in the Orthodox Church, correctly baptized in the Orthodox Church, and then baptized again, not of somebody who had, and I'm doing air quotes, a baptism in the Protestant Church or the Catholic Church where there was no grace of it there. That's not, it's called baptism, but it's just like, it's not, it's just using the word. It's not the actual baptism. It's not the ontological baptism.
Saint Basil, as we read at the beginning of this live stream, of this discussion here on Economia, Saint Basil says, even if they say they have it, they have to be received by ours. So Basil doesn't believe that the heretics have the mystery. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem doesn't believe that the heretics have the mystery. He clearly says only heretics should receive the baptism, the proper baptism, to be rebaptized. But even more to the point today, obviously the fathers didn't believe that the mysteries exist outside the body, because then you would have a split body, or you'd have a schizophrenic body, or you would have a church outside the church, or you'd have a mystery which is incomplete. And all these ideas in the ecumenist, milieu don't stand up to the patristic test. But so even beyond that, I ask people when they say, well, I was baptized as a fill in the blank, should I be baptized as Orthodox? And my answer was, were you baptized?
Yeah.
And not just in terms of the mystery, even the form you didn't receive. And I asked them, did you receive the triple immersion? 99% of the time they say no, because they don't.
Right.
They're either one immersion in the Baptists, or they have just sprinkling or pouring over the head. Neither of those are what the Orthodox consider to be a baptism. And that's very clear in the canons, very clear in the fathers. We're not talking about economia when somebody's on their deathbed, obviously, but according to the Corrective of the church, according to the teaching of the fathers, that's what we do. And when they depart from it conscientiously, systematically, this is no longer a basis for economia. It doesn't exist. And we do it to our own detriment.
Right.
And I think it's obvious that we create problems where there need be no problem for the church.
Right. You said something about how Elder Ephraim had received the gift that he could see if somebody had been baptized or not. Or you could see if somebody had the guardian angel, and you receive the guardian angel when you're baptized.
Yes.
It's just
Yes. He had many gifts, as you'll see it in the life of Elder Ephraim that's coming out in several volumes. It's being prepared by the sisters and fathers in the various monasteries that he founded. And you'll see the many, many gifts that God gave him to see. There are many witnesses to him knowing the entire history of someone's spiritual life. from childhood, and he would go through and help them to make their confession and remember all the sins. So these are gifts that God gives to very holy men and women, and it's very rare in our day. It's you can count them probably on a few hands today, or one hand even, the great saints that had these gifts, but they're not unknown in church history at all. Many saints had these gifts of clairvoyance or foreknowledge. And so there is witness. I've met people that said that, he saw that they did not have the grace of the mystery of baptism. Elder Emilianos, who's a renowned elder from Simonopetra, and that monastery is well known for its publications and its very high academic standards, and many intellectuals love Simonopetra, the monastery. Well, Elder Emilianos said to a friend of mine who was a Greek priest in America, when he went as a new convert with only chrismation, he said to him, "Where's your baptism? Where's your guardian angel?" And so it wasn't just Elder Ephraim.
Yeah.
So God allows that for the salvation of mankind. And so if you see that and you know that, you're not going to take lightly this question.
No, exactly. Yeah. So just a one last kind of thought before we end this discussion is, if somebody's listened or been listening to all of our talk about baptism and this topic and the importance of it, and they are like, oh, I was received by chrismation, or somebody that's like, oh, when I was received by baptism, it was just by aspersion. What would you recommend to them if they desired to have? Is there a corrective baptism that they can have? Like, what would be the process like that? Because that's a heavy weight for someone to carry if they're thinking about that, or, like what would you suggest that they do?
Well, first of all, the idea of so-called corrective baptism, there is no such thing as a corrective baptism. There is just baptism.
Okay.
So the question is, were you ever baptized? And again, the baptism means immersion, and in the Orthodox Church, it means triple immersion. And so if there was that, even among the heterodox, and there was a need for economia, I would say you're fine. But neither of those exist today.
Right.
There's no need, because many people are begging priests to be baptized and they're being refused.
Yep.
Or there's no basis because they've abandoned even the basic form, again, which that's all the heretics have is the form. They don't have the grace. So again, the question is, were they baptized? Not, should we correct their baptism? There is no baptism outside the church, and there's not even the form today. And so I'm not, the Holy Synod or a bishop to tell them, although bishops can certainly do that. If bishops determine, they can certainly say, all of you people or you here need to have the mystery of baptism performed. Like I said, there's a canon in the Ecumenical Council that allows for that if there's a doubt as to whether the mystery took place properly and according to the church's teaching. So I don't know. I can't answer. Father Peter Heers does not have an answer for that. It's above my pay grade. My job is to point to the patristic teaching. I will say that it's well known in Orthodox Church that the Holy Fathers of Mount Athos, great contemporary saints like Elder Ephraim or Elder Emilianos or Elder Parthenios of St. Paul's, who's still alive, they have been there for over 50 years, they definitely consider it a mistake that needs to be corrected, and they do it regularly. And so people go to Mount Athos from all over the world, and they beg the fathers there, please, I was received incorrectly, and I want to receive the holy mystery of baptism. And they've done it, and they do it. It's not a mystery. The Patriarchate knows it. They tried to stop it, and then they realized they can't, because there's actually synodical decisions that support this. And it goes on, and it goes on in many monasteries. And so I don't know. What do you do with that? Are the fathers on Mount Athos deluded? Are they heretics? Are they legalists? Are they stuck to the law? Are they stuck to the form? Do they only care about forms? Are they form lovers? What are they doing? What are they doing? What is Elder Parthenios, who Saint Basil said, there are many abbots on Mount Athos, but only one Parthenios. And he's the abbot of St. Paul's that published Father George Metalinos's famous work, I Confess One Baptism,
right,
that people hate because he points out everything I'm talking about today. So that was the monastery. This was the elder, and he's baptized many people in the Aegean Sea. So is Elder Parthenios deluded? Is he a heretic? Is he, again, a legalist? Because that seems to be the implication. When people say, oh, these terrible, terrible monks or these terrible priests or these terrible people who are insisting that people receive a proper Orthodox baptism, they're legalists. They're whatever. they're blaspheming God. Well, okay, then I guess Mount Athos has been lost to heresy. And but if everybody knows Mount Athos, it's the source for the last 1,000 years in many ways of spiritual regeneration again and again in the Orthodox world. It was from Mount Athos that the Philokalia came. It was from Mount Athos that Saint Paisius brought and translated and brought to the whole Slavic world the Philokalia. It was from Mount Athos that missionaries have gone out again and again throughout the Orthodox world, or to Africa today. So I don't think Mount Athos is fallen into heresy or delusion. So we have to deal with this. People don't want to deal with this. Father Peter's a crank. The monks are crazy. Okay, that you're not dealing with this.
Right.
This is something that's been
it's like it's like gaslighting almost. Yeah. So just what you were saying, like, so if somebody had just immersion, even though an Orthodox priest did it, that's not so if that's a baptism still? I mean, because I was just saying, like, the corrective baptism, someone's like, oh, there is no corrective baptism, but if somebody had aspersion, or just, not a full triple immerged fully, and they go to Mount Athos, say, and they explain that.
Orthodox Christians who were improperly baptized,
yes,
you're talking about?
Yes. Orthodox Christians who are improperly baptized.
Again, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, yes, that does happen in some places on Mount Athos. I don't think it's as common as them saying that, you should have been received, if you're a heterodox, you should have been received by baptism. But I wouldn't be surprised if on Athos there are fathers, because it's witnessed in the 1700s on Mount Athos that this is going on, that they're insisting that people be properly baptized. And I have to say this. The Lord said to the Pharisees, you should keep both the one and the other, right? The deeper parts of the law and the more, let's say, formal parts of the law. In somewhere in the gospel, I'm paraphrasing. In other words, if people want to play the formal, external, legalistic card, these men on Athos are very, very well versed in the spiritual struggle, right? They understand when you give rights to the enemy. They understand when the devil mocks you. They understand what everything we do has an impact spiritually. They understand what it means to be faithful, right? So it is a wishful thinking, and also a travesty and damage to one's own spiritual outlook if they insist that they're a bunch of legalists on Mount Athos who are just stuck on the form. Obviously, they're concerned about faithfulness, and they're concerned about the spiritual life. And they see that when we intentionally, systematically depart from what God and the saints and the Lord in the gospel and in the canons teach, there will be implications in the spiritual life. And they don't want that to happen. Right. They don't want people to be giving rights to the enemy. So I think that their insistence on the Father's teaching, what they've been handed down, is something we should imitate, not mock, which is what happens in some circles, which is really a tragedy. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not beyond that. I think we probably covered our bases. Yeah, God help us.
Yeah, definitely. I receive a lot of messages from people, because I've talked about how my story, and how coming in as a reception of a heterodox right here, and I wanted that baptism, and I've told my story, and I have a lot of people that contact me that were just chrismated, or they were brought into the Orthodox faith as a heretic, and they didn't have the full immersion, and I never know what to say to them. I never know,
You send them to spiritual fathers. That's the order of things. These are things that the economia of the church, the economy of salvation, is worked out through the bishops and the priests and the abbots and the spiritual fathers. And these are difficult decisions and how it should be handled. As I said several times, there's canonical precedent. If someone has doubt whether they've been properly initiated, there's canons in the ecumenical councils. We talk about them in the book. But that's got to be applied by bishops and priests who are responsible.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It goes to the spiritual father, and that's so important that everybody has a spiritual father. So, okay, I thank you so much for talking more about Economia. really appreciate that. I feel like I've been enlightened to so much more on it, and I understand it so much better, and it definitely completes this conversation. So thank you, Father Peter, for coming back on the Let's Be Friends podcast. Yeah, and thank you, everybody, for listening, and we hope that you have a great evening.